Melissa is owner of Coates Data Strategies. She's got her own intro slide, so I'm not going to go into every single detail, but there's a link here, and there will be, I'll put it in chat also during the course of the meeting, her blog URL. And so the meeting materials will be there, and a link to the video once we get that posted will also be there. And let me turn things over now to Melissa Coates. Welcome, Melissa.
All right. Hopefully you can see me, hear me, all that good stuff. So yes,
yep.
We're going to talk about trustworthiness tonight. So let me explain to you, what do I mean by that? We're going to have a very short discussion about level setting, starting out with why we care. And then we're basically going to just use building blocks, and we're going to talk about data sets and data flows and composite models. That's going to lead us into talking about certifying content, what that really means. And that's going to then take us into a few other things we can do, and why you might think about workspace structure. We're down here to item number 6, and why that impacts trustworthiness. And then we will wrap up with just a set of things that you might consider doing to help your colleagues discover and find your content and use your content well once you've actually put forth all the effort. This is actually a pretty fast-moving, almost an intermediate session. So if there's some concept you need me to pause and elaborate on, just let us know in the chat, and I will certainly double back and elaborate more on something. I will also be able to stop for questions basically at each one of these transition points. So feel free to pop them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on things. Mike and Mark will help me with that if you guys all get like a chit chat, and they're going to help me filter out the questions. So feel free to toss them in as they come, but this is the progression of concepts that we're going to talk about. And then if you'd like a copy of the slides, and the recording link will be here as well, you can find them on my presentations page. And I'm Melissa Coates. As you mentioned, I'm self-employed, and I specialize in governance and administration type of topics, which makes me a little bit different from most Power BI people, because I don't go really deep on the development side anymore. And so I spend most of my time these days doing two things. One is authoring content for Microsoft. And so if you've seen the Power BI adoption roadmap, or you've seen the new pieces of what we're calling Power BI implementation planning, those are some really fun things that I've been working with Matthew Roche on. And then I've got an online course as well. So if you like what you hear tonight, this is, one little bit of the broader thing. So having said all of that, let's dig in, and let's talk just very briefly about why are we thinking about trustworthiness. And we tend to think about these different ways of delivering BI within the organization. So we've got this notion of enterprise BI is very, very centralized. So this first column shown here, in some sort of centralized team would usually own and manage both the data and the reports. And on the complete other side of that, the business units take complete control end to end for what we would call business-led self-service BI. And then there's this, what we think of as the sweet spot in between, is what we tend to call managed self-service BI, where the data is centralized and business authors take more responsibility for the reports. And I pause when I say that, because that is a really important concept, and Microsoft likes to refer to that as discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge. But the reason that I pause when I say that is we don't have to say that the data is owned and managed by a centralized team. It doesn't have to be that, oh, only IT can touch it, in order to take advantage of all of these concepts that we're going to talk about that actually make this idea of discipline at the core a really good idea for trustworthiness. So even if you're in a fully decentralized area, we can still take advantage of the concepts we're going to talk about. Now, what do I usually mean when I'm using this loaded term of trustworthy content? And the first thing is, yeah, the content is accurate. We have good data quality. We are using common definitions, so our data is understandable, and things like our definitions and our key performance indicators, those are things that we understand what we're seeing. We know who's responsible and who owns and manages this content, not only for who to go for with questions, but we understand who's responsible for owning and managing it, and that can sometimes affect some of our processes for things like certifying and promoting content, and we're going to get into all of that part during this session. We know where the data comes from, so we can trace back the lineage or the provenance of the data. We know what the authoritative source is. We know how the data changes and moves over time. One of my favorites. If you ever hear me talk, I have to mention this. We don't duplicate the data unnecessarily. So if you're in an organization of 3,000 reports and you have darn near 3,000 data sets, I'm going to be screaming that there is some cause for concern there. And so we'll talk more about that as well. That's where we're going to start digging in here in a moment. And our data and our load processes are managed and secured. Things are automated when possible. Here, I'm really just talking about even if you're a business analyst, if you can remove manual effort, you reduce your risk. And when you reduce your risk, you improve your trustworthiness of the content. This idea of awareness of content. So we can help people discover and find content. And guess what? That means they're going to use things we already have, which helps with the data duplication. But when we have investment in things we've already created and more people use them, it fundamentally becomes more trustworthy because it's more used. And if there's flaws, people will find them and get them fixed. And then finally, we have this idea of clear expectations about what responsible data use means. And a perfect example of that is our sensitivity labels. If you've got, say, a set of 4 or 5 labels that you assign to content, you know what that label really means. What should you or should you not do with that label? So these are the kinds of things I mean when I say trustworthy. So it's a whole lot of stuff. Let me start with one of my favorite topics, and that is shared data sets, or this idea of reusing our data models. And where almost everybody starts out is one data set per report. That's what you're going to do when you sit down to your very first day of training, and that's okay. The thing is over time, as a content author, it should start to dawn on you, or someone who's training you should be telling you that it doesn't have to be this way forever. So in this screen, I'm showing that I have 3 reports. They're actually all sales related. So they don't need 3 completely distinct data sets, probably. So one thing the author might do is say, well, okay, I'm just going to put all my reports into one PBIX file, and then I've got my data set and everything. And that can work, especially if you're using an app and you use app menus. So this is not necessarily completely off the table. However, putting everything into one PBIX file is not necessarily scalable. It can get a little unwieldy as far as a lot of stuff inside one file. So where we really want our more experienced authors to be is thinking about decoupling the experience of data creation and report creation. So here I'm showing you I've got the data set in one PBIX file and the reports in other PBIX files. And so this isn't difficult to do. It's just a habit change, and it requires training to teach people that this is a thing that that we should do. So when we're decoupling, where we really want to be is, let's say we've got this sales data shared data set, And so here, let's say I've got a live connection to multiple reports. And here I'm showing one Power BI report and one paginated report. So we're doing a live connection. We're not duplicating the data again, just because we need a new kind of report. We can do the same thing when we're connecting via Excel. Same thing conceptually, we just call it something a little bit different. So if you've heard the term a golden data set and thin reports, a lot of people in the community use that term. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Or if you've heard the term hub and spoke method, that one's not nearly as common. Same idea as well. So this is a good time to say that I'm not saying you should have one massive data set in your organization, but you should have relatively few data sets, and you should think through, do I need a new data set or can I augment the first one, right? It's easier said than done, especially when you need to move fast and get things published, but that's where we want to be mentally. So a few advantages of doing this is different people can then start handling data modeling and report creation easier because we have different files open. So if you're doing everything in Power BI Desktop, we can have different people working at the same time easier. Now, certainly we can enable some of that, especially on the data model side with other tools like Tabular Editor, but just keeping people in Power BI Desktop, it really helps. And that idea of discipline at the core, we're starting with our practices of how we manage the content and publish it to actually help support that whole idea of scaling that out. That turns into reduced risk. So I like the idea of fewer data sets because we have fewer inconsistencies in data, right? We always fight about whose data is right. We have reduced maintenance, reduced change effort when something changes, reduced level of data validations. And how about governance and compliance? It's not going to fix all of that, but fewer data sets means they're lessened. So if somebody asks you, where's the customer name stored, right? If you have fewer data sets, it makes that at least a lessened concern to deal with. That means then our report files, we can start focusing on individual use cases, and coupling that with the separate authors is really a nice thing. Performance-wise, kind of the biggie here is fewer data set refreshes. So especially if you've got really picky source systems, that sort of thing, or if you're finding yourself waiting for refreshes in the morning, that sort of thing. Security options. So when we start thinking about where we're going to deploy the content to separate workspaces, and we're going to touch on that later in this section, this habit sets us up to say, oh, I could deploy one PBIX file to one workspace and another one to another workspace, secure them separately, handle different use cases and different sets of people. Now, it would only be fair for me to say that there are some disadvantages. And if we are saying that a centralized data set is what we want, that means we have to have a little bit more oversight. So generally speaking, if we're saying process over speed, well, you know, it needs to have a little bit more rigor and a little bit more process. We'll talk about that when we get to the certification part of this discussion. So that just isn't desirable for every single data set, especially ones that aren't going to be long-lived or used by a huge number of people. And from an ownership and responsibility perspective, if you want to ask for changes to a data set, for instance, and another team owns and manages that data set, are you going to get what you want? Now, we're going to talk about composite models here in a minute. That's one way that possibly you can get around that, but it's still an issue. Then we've got this idea of just because you're using the golden data set doesn't mean you don't have to test. And so we could end up with a little complacency. We might say that we don't end up having to test as thoroughly because, oh, we used the data set, but we can still have reports that are misleading and incorrect and confusing. So it doesn't, nothing's a silver bullet. You all know that. All right, so let me show you just a few things. The first building blocks, so to speak, of what we're talking about here. So I'm in a workspace called Sales Data, and if I go to my favorite Sales Data dataset, I'm just going to go and I want to look at its lineage. And we can see here that from a dependency perspective, this is just my demo environment, so the numbers are really tiny. So let's pretend that we can see over here that the sales analytics workspace is where all the action is happening. That's where, if in fact we're going to impact this data set with some sort of change, that's what we really need to worry about. So those are things, of course, we need to think about when we are building in a dependency on a data set like that. Now, over here in the sales analytics piece, this is really about impact analysis downstream of the data set. So one thing that we can do with that, there's a little link here. And you don't actually know all the people that you're emailing with this, but this is one way you could make an announcement that the content's changing. The other way I would suggest at least doing this as well is having some sort of, say, Teams channel where when major changes happen to a data set like this, they're logged over there and announced and that sort of thing. So that's sort of a downstream look at it. Now, if we pop over to the sales analytics workspace and say, I want to think more upstream, if you will. So something like product sales analysis. If I do a view lineage on it, here's it. There's the sales data that we just looked at. The experience is a little bit different, but we know that looking at a report and knowing where its data came from is a really important thing. So it's not the exact same kind of experience as that impact analysis, but we can see it both directions, if you get my meaning. Now, let me hop over to desktop for a second. And the other thing that I want to illustrate briefly is, let's say what I just did is I did a get data to Power BI data sets. And here's my handy dandy sales data right at the top. We can see that it's certified, etc. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And I now have a new report. We see that it is connected live to the Power BI data set. So that's how easy it is for somebody that needs to create a report to just connect live instead of, start bringing in data, etc. So anybody that's got the build permission on that data set will be able to see it in the list. All right, so I'm going to leave that open because we're going to need that again here in just a little bit. So the big point here is that it's a simple change, but it achieves a lot for governance and data reusability. So we are going to come back to that. The other thing that I want to show you at this point before we move on with the conversation is a couple of tenant settings that are really important to make this idea of live connecting to a data set work. And so the first one is under export and sharing. The big one is called allow live connections. So normally my recommendation is just enable that for the entire organization. In most cases, you wouldn't want to narrow that down to a group of users, but of course you could if you needed to. And then the other one, because you've already seen me starting to use separate workspaces and that sort of thing, you want to definitely make sure that use data sets across workspaces is also enabled. So those are the two biggies to make this scenario work. All right. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to move on and take this concept of data reuse one step further, and we're going to talk a moment about data flows. So if you find yourself in the situation where you've got all this work to do data prep, and you work in the query editor, and you do your transformations, and you've got stuff in various different PBIX files, and you might have things that you copy paste from one PBIX to another, or you might even find yourself keeping your own personal library of M scripts. That starts to scream, I need to reuse my data preparation. So just like we talked about reusing a data set, a lot of the same ideas, just a little bit different use case. So starting with kind of where we were before, we've got, here I'm showing 3 shared data sets across 5 reports. What I want to have also then is, instead of the data preparation happening 3 separate times, we're going to have it happen once in a data flow. So as data flow goes and gets data from 1 or more source systems, I didn't put that here on the page. And we do this work in Power Query Online though. And so same familiar interface that, you know, your authors are used to in Power BI Desktop, they're just working in the web. And then that data gets fed into a data set. So the reason that we really like this, one of them is similar. If you've got different people, just like we said before, we can take this idea of taking different responsibilities one step further. And if you've got somebody that goes really deep on the Power Query side, and it's somebody different that goes really deep on the data modeling side, now you can handle that a little bit easier without passing PBIX files back and forth. This shields your authors from those super nasty, complex source systems. We all know the ones that are just tricky to get data out of and take a lot of effort and learning. And so the people then that are creating the data sets, when you give them the data flows data that's already pre-staged, almost like a data warehouse, but I don't want to go too far and say that it's a complete replacement for data warehouse, because it's not. But they have less effort because you have given them a nice set of data. This also allows us to say, if we've got some common data that we want our data set creators around the business units to reuse, things like customer and product, etc., data flows is a great way to do that. Things that are useful to many teams, like the annual budgets, right? Same idea as the dimensional data, just passing them along in a usable form. Standard security mappings is a really interesting use case for it as well. Again, if you've got a data warehouse or a database that has all of this data already, great. That's a perfect situation, but a lot of customers don't, and this is at least a really good thing to evaluate for that. The data behind a data flow, I don't want to go deep into this side, but it's stored in a data lake. And so depending on how you configure things, you can actually, what they call bring your own data lake and access it with other tools or outside of Power BI. And as you can expect, that increases the reusability of the data even more. So one of my favorite things. It can be your authoritative source for your data set authors within reason, kind of depending on your needs. We reduce the load on our source systems, which is huge. Fewer authors need to directly access the source system. So we talked a moment ago about when you've got those picky, tricky ones, but also permissions to access source systems can just be complex to dole out. And it improves consistency. So here's my suggestion is put as much as possible into the data flow to reduce the work that the dataset author needs to do. So friendly names, assigning the data types, if you do use some sort of calculated column, removing what you don't need, right? Of course, we can't do measures. It's not a data model. So those sorts of magical measures don't go in here. But what we can do in the columns and the rows, put them into the data flows where you can. So if we pop back out to desktop, let me actually open a second one here real quick. I do a get data, and this time I'm going to choose Power BI data flows. There's really just one thing I want to illustrate, and that is, let's say we want to pull, doesn't matter. The data here doesn't matter. So, let's say I want some tables, and I'm going to choose transform here. The only thing that I really want to illustrate is Power Query Online is a similar interface, but those data set creators that we said give them the data flow starting point, here's the thing. They bring that data flow data into the query editor. So they still have the flexibility to make adjustments or additional transformations or changes. So we're not limiting them to say, you have to use this data as is, which I think is really kind of a big factor. It's just a nice, clean starting point. From a tenant setting perspective, there is one tenant setting to create and use data flows. So to make this happen, we need to have this enabled. And this one always just applies to the entire organization. We can't apply this to individual users. All right, so those are our two building blocks from a data model perspective. So now we're ready to take this concept one step further. And as a reminder, if you have a question, pop it in the chat and we'll pause and we'll take it. So here the idea is we want to bridge enterprise BI and self-service BI, or if you think about it, centralized and decentralized. We're trying to extend that flexibility, yet keep things trustworthy. So our starting point is, let's say we've already got a shared data set and we're doing a live connection to it, but everything that I need from that data set isn't already in there. And we do a few report level measures and that kind of stuff, but I need more. I need another data source to be married up. So maybe 90% of what I need is there, but not everything. That's what we're handling with this new functionality that they call Direct Query for Power BI and Analysis Services, or I think informally the name is Composite Models. So if I say Composite Models, I'm saying this new direct query functionality. So really what's happening here, if we step through this page, let's say I've got this organizational data set, and it's the sanctioned data set, the certified data set, the blessed golden data set. And then we say for our particular use case, we need to bring in maybe something from an Excel file or some flat files, or we might even get something from another data flow. We just need to augment this original source with something more. And so that's the idea here of then these secondary level of data set. The composite model is now what the reports will point to. Now, one thing I do want to mention really quickly, because we're using the term direct query. Direct query in a different form has been around for a long time. We usually use that term for, oh, we want a direct query to Azure SQL database or something, and that's doing so against more of a storage engine. Here we're using direct query against a semantic model. So just a little bit different usage of that particular term. So we've got our remote model, that original shared data set. What we're going to do is we are going to then augment that remote model with some additional data. So in order to do that, we need to have what we call a local model. So we start out with just the organizational data plus the departmental data. And I'll show you what this looks like in desktop here in just a second. So the idea here then is we extend and we personalize that original data set. So this allows us to extend that centralized data model. So like we said, need a new data source. Maybe I need some new measures. Maybe I need a new hierarchy, whatever. There's also this idea of personalizing it. And here's where I get a little worried from a trustworthy perspective, but maybe you need to rename some columns and that sort of thing. So, you know, assuming that it still follows the standard data dictionary or any guidance like that, we can personalize and format and that sort of thing. So maybe you don't want it to be sales returns and allowances. You just want it to be returns. So assuming that we're not violating common definitions, we can certainly do that. And that's because these personalized items are just metadata changes only, and they're saved only in that local model. Again, different people can manage different pieces of the puzzle, but you can easily manage in this scenario where every single one of these data sets could be managed by a different person. So this really helps that scenario as well. Back to the discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge, less duplication of effort, reduced risk. One of my favorite things I like to achieve while we're also helping enable users get things done. So for all the same reasons that we talked about earlier. Now, there are a few disadvantages. One is we have another step in what we're querying. So it's never going to perform as well when we want to query a remote model as when we want to query just one step instead of two. So that is an expectation. Test it, check it, etc. And it's still a pretty new feature. It hasn't hit general availability yet. There are still some limitations to it, although we're cranking away on getting those addressed. I say, you know, we at the Royal We, the Power BI team. So the biggest pain point so far has been that, let's say, somebody reading a report way down here needs the build permission on all of the data sets up the chain just to be able to read. So the first piece of that has gotten resolved. So if your data sets are sitting in premium or PPU, one of those two workspaces, that is now resolved. If it's still on a pro workspace, they're working on it. They're getting there. The other thing, I don't know if it's a disadvantage as much as it's just a know that if you need to introduce row level security, it comes from the remote model, right? We don't define it down at the local model and then propagate it up to the remote model. So that means it's not like, even if we say the 90% of our needs are satisfied up there, it won't necessarily be the right answer every single time, but it's still a great thing to have in the tool belt. Expectations for accuracy, very similar to the thing that we talked about a few minutes ago. So we start with the original organizational model, our golden data set, and that means we might have unreasonable expectations for the downstream content that it's accurate, because just because you started from the original one doesn't mean you can't screw it up somewhere along the way. And the thing is if the issues become bad enough, it can actually tarnish the trustworthiness of that original organizational model. So we have to be a little bit careful, and that's all about training and educating people on what to do. And so if those downstream models are created poorly, they can create a lot of issues. And so the centralized BI team or that original model owner might be asked to fix these downstream issues, and they might not have the bandwidth to support this. And so you basically end up with multiple layers of technical debt. So just some things to watch out for. This is much more about training users to do things that are good processes and good testing and all that kind of stuff, much more than a criticism of the technology, if that makes sense. So let me just show you a couple things, and then we'll check on the questions that are over here in the chat. So we had this Power BI desktop file open earlier, and we said we were connected live to the data set. So all we need to do to be able to bring in something extra, we can do this in one of two spots. There's this make changes to the model down here, or on the modeling ribbon, there's this. And by the way, I was preparing for this earlier today. I'm like, why don't I see my make changes to the model? Where did it go? So somehow, purposefully or otherwise, this got turned off. So you do, for that to show up over on preview features, you've got to have direct query for PBI datasets and AS enabled, or it won't show up and you'll spin around for, 10 or 15 minutes like I did, saying I don't understand. So make changes to this model. You get this nice little message. And basically it's just reminding you that you're adding a local model. So we're going to say yes. And we can choose, yep, I'm just going to take all the tables for purposes of this because we don't actually care about the data for this illustration. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that over here on the left, I only have two panes. I have the report pane and I have the relationships pane. So now that I've turned it into something that I can augment, I'm going to do a get data. I'm just going to point to a little Excel workbook. And I'm just going to bring that in. I don't need to transform it, so I'm just going to hit load. Potential security risk, same thing that we would see. And okay, so guess what? Now we have a data pane because we have one table that's now imported into our local model. So here's my new table. I can create a relationship. I won't take our time to do that. You would understand all of that good stuff. And for the one table that I imported, I can see that in the data pane. So I just continue on, working like normal. So back over here, the ones that are in blue, if I hover on it, we can see that the storage mode is direct query for the ones that have the little blue header, and then this one up here without the blue header, that's my import. All right, so once I was done with all of this, and if I go back to sales data, my actual composite model with my ever so clever CM in the name is right here. So here in the lineage view, we can see where this particular report over here on the far right comes from a composite model that comes from another model. So we can see from a lineage perspective that, oh, there's a couple of hops and there's a couple of dependencies happening here. All right. Let me double check what we've got here going on. Okay, a monitor freezing will leave something like that to the end. Yep, okay. So this brings us to certifying content. One of my favorite topics. So now that we've basically built all the blocks to thinking about, we're going to invest time in creating these structures where we're purposefully setting up dependencies and purposefully reusing data. So that means we're probably going to want to certify it. So in this example, we're showing the original model here as being certified, and to encourage people to go ahead and use it, reuse it, we want to let them know that it's trustworthy. So let's talk about the two types of endorsements. Certified means the content is trustworthy, whereas promoted means the content is available. So when it's certified, that means some level of rigor needs to have occurred to be able to say this is trustworthy. And for instance, let's say we have 20 different reports over a few different workspaces that are all set as certified. This is easier said than done, but theoretically, we want the expectation for trustworthiness, right? Accuracy, etc., to be relatively the same for all of those reports. So that means there needs to be a process. There needs to be a list of what needs to happen. So promoted doesn't mean that it's not trustworthy, but it is and shouldn't be something less than certified. Now, having said that, we'll see in the tenant settings in a minute, certified is something you got to have permission to do, and it should be a fairly small number of people. It doesn't have to be only IT or only the BI people. If you've got some trusted and trained people out in the business units, like your Power BI champions, or if you have some federated members of your Center of Excellence that are out in the business units, those are great people to teach them what to do to certify content. That's great. But not every org can make that kind of thing happen, or they might not be ready for it yet. So it might be that, say, only the Center of Excellence or the BI team can certify content. And in that case, sometimes business teams end up using the promoted endorsement almost like it's certified just because they can't easily get content certified. But the way I'm defining it is this way. Just know that how promoted is used can just vary a lot between departments and between authors, whereas I would like certified to be consistent in terms of its expectations. All right. So what can be endorsed? We have three main buckets of things that can be endorsed: data, reports, and the app. And these three distinctions are actually really important. So let me explain why they're important. When we say the first bucket, our data. So let's say we want to certify this data set. The next level down is a report. So that means who we're actually targeting for a certified data set are report authors. And we're telling those report authors, you can use this data set, you can trust it, you can take a dependency on it with your reports because it's trustworthy. Same idea with a certified data flow. This time we're targeting data set authors and saying you can trust this data flow and take a dependency on it while you're creating your data set. So this idea of data certification applies to authors. Now, if we're certifying a report, it's a little bit different because we're saying it's not so much a technical dependency in the chain. It's more like consumers of this report can trust the data to make decisions from it or take action or whatever you're supposed to do with the particular report. So not a technical dependency and more oriented towards the end consumer of the information. The app means, hey, I have this collection of reports in here and I can I can show that the app itself is certified. But here's where it gets tricky. How do you collectively certify all of the content within the app, right? And it's different from the individual item endorsements in the workspace. So let me show you what I mean by that. Starting with the sales analytics workspace, if I go to something like my product sales analysis and its settings, I have this certified radio button enabled because I'm allowed to do this in the tenant settings. I've got a link here that says, how do I get my report certified? And this is going to just, it's an ugly little SharePoint page in my demo tenant. So basically it's indicating that this is the group you need to be part of so that you can actually use that functionality. And some other, information behind it, documenting how the certification process works. So if we sort the content in here by my endorsement, I have 2 reports in this workspace that are certified, and I have 1 that is promoted. Okay. Notice that if I make my thing a little bit smaller here, notice that there are a lot more reports included in the app than are actually set to be endorsed. Okay, so you probably know where I'm headed with this. I'm going to go to this little ellipsis up here, and I'm going to edit app endorsement, and we can see that the entire app is set to certified. All right, so I go actually look at the app, and if I go and I look at, say, the gross margin analysis down here, this is one that's promoted over in the workspace, but guess what? Inside of the app, it indicates as certified. So I call this out only so that from a process perspective, you actually address where the work is done to certify. And now if nobody sees the content in the actual workspace other than the people that manage and edit it, and they're not confused, it's okay. But I kind of have a preference to be neat and tidy and have everything jive. So just kind of keep an eye on that, especially if you've got viewers in a workspace and in an app. And from a tenant setting perspective, the thing to make that work is a certification setting. Here is also where you get to specify a URL for the documentation page, so that link that I showed you. And then I recommend having a group. Mine is called Power BI Certification Subject Matter Experts. So the group itself is Power BI specific. It says certification in the name and SMEs. Now, granted, you could use multiple groups if you want, but I kind of like to have a very specific one for this very specific purpose. All right, so Colin says in the chat, I think you shouldn't be able to certify a report unless the underlying data set was previously certified. I think in most cases that is a very good way to go. And can I uncertify a data set that was used in a certified report? Sure, you can edit the setting to uncertify the data set for sure. We're going to talk at the end about report branding. And one of the most important things that you can do for a report is have some sort of logo or whatever, and we'll talk about that here shortly. But I think it depends on your process, and it also depends, by the way, on the data set that's underlying that report, is that data set open to self-service users to create other reports from it? If so, I 100% think they should both be certified. If the data set you know for sure is not going to be opened up for self-service users, just reports, it's really kind of an enterprise BI situation. I'm not quite so worried about anything beyond the report itself and then the report being branded. So basically it's an it depends kind of situation. Let's talk a moment about separate workspaces. So we know we have this multiple levels and we are likely to have different people responsible for maintaining each level. So where do we publish this content? I propose that we have the notion of a data workspace and a reporting workspace. Here's why. Really comes down to permissions. On the data workspace, you got to give a workspace role, admin member contributor, to whomever's going to manage that data. And on the report workspace, you got to do the same thing, admin member contributor for whoever your report authors are. And there's usually a lot more of them than there are data editors, usually. And then this report authors, they only get the build permission on the data set. Because the problem, if these are all in the same workspace, you end up having the honor system for report authors that say, I promise I'm not going to touch the data set. And sure, that can work sometimes, especially in small teams. I'm not saying make it harder than it needs to be. But if you need to protect that data set and make sure it's not inadvertently edited by someone unauthorized, this is a good way to do it. So it also gives us clarity on who's responsible for what. So not only the honor system, but the workspace roles basically also help with ownership, especially if you've got cross-team collaboration or any sort of co-ownership situations. This can all help to make that a little bit more clear. From a security perspective, I mentioned a moment ago about the build permission to allow people to not only read the data in the data set, but build their own reports from it. But here's a huge, huge advantage. When I said a minute ago, if these were all in the same workspace and we'd have the honor system because your report authors have either admin member or contributor because they'd need it to publish reports, guess what happens on the data set if you have those kinds of edit permissions? Row level security is ignored. Row level security will only work if you have view permissions on the data set, and this is the way to achieve it. You have read and build on the data set, or just read if you're just a viewer of the report. But if you need row level security to work, this is the way to achieve it. Now, of course, does mean we have more workspaces. And so, you know, can things get a little out of control if we don't carefully manage them? And even if we do carefully manage them, maybe it gets a little out of control. So that is the downside. All right, so let's look at that here briefly. So over in my workspace list, if I just do a search for data, I've got some various workspaces that's got that in the name. And basically that's my naming convention to say data is going to exist in here. And we haven't talked about separating out data sets from data flows. And that's a thing that is also useful as well. But to keep it simple, this is what I've done. So basically other workspaces would be considered a reporting workspace, which would be expected to only contain reports and maybe sometimes data sets for sure. All right, so let's pull together a few of these ideas and start to wrap it up. We've put together all this effort. You have trustworthy content. You've done your data validations, and how do we actually convey that to our consumer population or to other people? So first, when we have our endorsed data sets, so by endorsed, we mean certified or promoted, we want them to be discoverable. And that's all about helping people search, locate, find their relevant, data sources and artifacts around the organization. And our goal here is that people are aware data exists, especially if they're in siloed departmental systems. And of course, we all play nice and share our data where we can. I know we do. But the idea here is once a user is aware it exists, the user goes through a standard process to request access, and it has various advantages. So let me show you what this looks like in the Power BI world. I'm going to visit the Datasets Hub. And so this is basically an all-up view of all of the data sets that I either have permission to or I am able to discover. So I've got, here's my all view. Now here's one that just popped up with the latest release. Trusted in your org. I hate this label. Now, I want to say that everything that's set to be certified and promoted is trusted. But I feel like this label here is taking a lot of license with the fact that it's set to be promoted or certified. So I wish this label was just endorsed. So having said all that, this just popped up and it's just really a filter to say that there's an endorsement on the content. So if I pop over to, I'm in another window where I'm logged in as another user. So this other user sees a lot less in his all view. I want to point out this one right here. This one, sales data, see how it's kind of a lighter color. I can't tell the owner. This is the one where he's discovering it exists, but he doesn't actually have permission to it yet. So this is the experience. And if I hover on this little information button, they can see that, oh, here's the description. So you can tell that I gave a nice description of what's in this data set and questions, contact so-and-so. And I did that in the description because the owner is hidden. So how we make that work? If I go back to my regular window and we go to sales data, and I'm going to go over to its settings. How this is actually working is under endorsement and discovery, there is this little make discoverable checkbox, and you're only going to be able to make it discoverable if it's promoted or certified. So from a process perspective, that actually kind of makes sense. Now, if we go back over to the user who is discovering it, I want to point out that there is this little button right here to request access to work with this data set. And here's a nice little message. We'd like you to use blah, blah, blah. Please request the form located blah, 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 blah. So how that's working is also in the data set under the request access box here. I've got, the nice little message about where to do the form. I say you'll be asked for a brief business justification, and the manager of the Center of Excellence will be required to approve the request, and access will be audited every 6 months. So they know upfront what to expect. So you can give them a really nice message. Over in the tenant settings, there are 3 relevant tenant settings to making this all work. So the first one, I'm gonna do the third one first. Discover content, where we're gonna say allow users to find and request access to content they don't have access to. So the way this is worded, is this gonna ever apply to more than just data sets? I have no earthly idea, but a girl can hope the way that they have worded this tenant setting. Then there's 2 tenant settings, one's for promoted, one's for certified. Allow users in the org who can certify content to make it discoverable. So I have chosen here in my demo environment, my same people that are allowed to certify are allowed to set it discoverable, but this is a different setting. So if you needed to manage it a little bit differently, you could. So that's all really useful from a data set reuse perspective and using data discovery. Now, the process to certify content, there can be a whole lot to it, and we could spend a whole hour and a half just talking about that. But at a bare minimum, you want to think about the data sources. Are they correct? Are they original data sources that you're using for your data set, trustworthy, etc.? Do a tech review of the data model. Lots of things that you could validate to make sure that there's not just a load of technical debt that's going to have problems later. You want to review the reports and the visualizations. Is it clear what their purpose is? Are they well designed? Do they follow good practices? All that kind of stuff. You want to look at security, not just row level security, that's important, but also what's the target workspace and what's the sensitivity level. Certainly your data accuracy validation, that's really important. Is there documentation? So there should be some level of required documentation for certified content. For instance, a required informational page, and I'm going to give you an example of that here in a second. From a report documentation perspective, here we're thinking about the consumers of our content. So we want to make people understand, well, what's the purpose and the audience and what business rules and all this kind of stuff that might be useful to understand and use this report better. And guess what? That report becomes way more trustworthy when you've got information. So, you know, this could just be an information page. It could be tooltips. It could be bookmarks. It could be a SharePoint page, right? You could do this a whole bunch of different ways. I'm just more focused on thinking about making sure that the data set is documented from a maintenance perspective and reports are documented from a consumer perspective. You might also think about a change log. So who changed what when? It could be just a little hidden page in the dataset file just to jot down the major changes that happened over time. I know I don't remember what I did last month. Think about a data quality dashboard. So not just the author or owner being able to verify behind the scenes, but that your report consumers can also use it separately from the report to check validations or check that the reconciliation process has all greens, that might have a little button to, I see a data issue, I want to submit a question or a concern, things like that that help people submit concerns and questions can really help resolve issues when you have them, and or just a little more transparency in this kind of area helps trustworthiness. Actually setting a bunch of these properties over in the service is helpful. So who's the contact for the report or the workspace, etc.? What's the description? I showed you that description earlier about, hey, here's exactly what's in this data set. Fill out the sensitivity label, fill out the endorsement, the discoverability, those custom instructions for requesting all access. All these things kind of coupled together help trustworthiness. So let me show you my admittedly very ugly little example of my documentation. One of these days, I will take time to make it prettier, but I am here in my sales data workspace. And if I go over to the all view and I sort, you might say, well, Melissa, why are there reports? You said this is a data workspace. And these reports are the documentation for the data sets. So I'm going to actually look at this sales data report. And I told you it's ugly. It sure is. But, you know, we talk about what's the source and the purpose, and if there's any custom business rules, and who maintains it, and how much history, and are there any known issues, all of this kind of stuff that it doesn't have to be fancy. It just needs to be somewhere. And even if you just kind of save yourself next month or next quarter or next year. And then I've got a second little page with my, again, ugly little thing with just a little change log of what changed when. So if you've ever published a data set and said, oh, I have to go and delete the empty report, this is actually another good little workaround to say, I don't have to delete the empty report because I'm using the report. So there's that. So a few final thoughts, and then we can use the remainder of our time just for any final questions. My two final thoughts that I'll leave you with is this notion that everybody's a data steward. So securing and protecting data and making it trustworthy is part of all of our jobs. And we want to try with the either governance policies or user guidelines or documentation or support, all these things that we hopefully are doing to support the users in our org. We want to help them do the right thing in the normal course of their work, but also use the activity log to discover when something's happening that maybe isn't quite right. For instance, somebody's shared a report out of my workspace and it's getting hundreds of views a week, right? That needs to be elsewhere. But, you know, try to help people do the right thing, but in the easiest possible way so that it's not disruptive and burdensome to them getting their job done. All right, so we can spend the rest of our time with Q&A. I will leave this up as well. The thing that I want to point out, if any of you joined late, is where you can get the slides that I just went through are here at the URL at the top left. So let me, whoops, put that back up for you, and I'm going to relocate you all so I can see you better over by my camera.
Yep, there are a couple of questions that have been posted in chat, and additionally, if people want to come off mute to ask a question, that's totally fine too.
Super. I like the one from Prabhav. Hi, Prabhav. To avoid confusion, is it a good idea to rename the documentation report to sales data dataset documentation? Will this affect republishing the dataset to change the report name back to the original? You know, I have not tried to do that, so I would have to double check what exactly happens in the Power BI service if we were to rename this. My guess is that then we would get another sales data report once we renamed this one, but I'd have to double check it. If anybody knows exactly what happens, feel free to pipe up and let us know. Number of views that the report gets. Let me see if I've got a usage. Find, where do I have a report with a little usage? Where did I put it? Well, the question about how do you track the number of views? I have one somewhere, but what you can do if you don't want to start pulling activity log data from, you know, the Microsoft 365 side of things, there's a nice little PowerShell commandlet to make that easier. But if you really are just focusing on a report or a workspace, there is a usage metrics report there that it will create. And then you can basically, once it creates it, say for this report, if you pretend I have 10 reports in this workspace, we can go and we can edit it to change the filter and actually look at everything for the workspace as a whole. So for the people that are just straight up business authors and not, say, the BI team or IT or the COE who's trying to monitor the entire organization activity, right? They can use this. You know, there's nothing here, but this is the easiest, fastest ways to get usage analytics that's usually geared more towards helping the authors just understand who's using what. So sorry, I don't have a good one handy. I know I've got one over here somewhere, but let's see. David says, I have included the changelog, requirements, and wireframes into actual reports on separate tabs for user consumption. Love it, love it, love it. Gold star for you. Let's see. Raul says, any tips or guidance for when you have a live Azure Analysis Services tabular model as a data source? That's a pretty general question. So since I don't know what you're driving at, I don't have any tips. So I guess if you have anything more specific, that we could try to tackle that.
Question? Where's the camera? Can you hear me?
We can see you too.
Hi, Tom.
You know, when you use a shared data set, which I love, how do you handle when you start letting other people use it and you kind of get locked into potentially a contract that your data model has certain names or certain meanings, and then you want to move on and fix things or whatever? How do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So you've got a situation where you need to rename some things, clean it up, but you know you're going to break the downstream reports. So over at Analysis Services, there's actually a nice little property, and I don't remember what it's called, but it's basically helping you alias. And somebody help me. To my knowledge, Power BI, that the Power BI side doesn't have that. And so I think then you're talking about, do we live with it, or do we deal with changing it now and communicating to downstream all of the users? But I think whenever you can have a smaller rollout of a new model and, you know, build that up over time, that can help. But you're right, that's a pain point, and sometimes you just got to deal with it.
No magic bullet then, huh?
No magic bullet. Thank you, Peter. Okay, yeah, no alias server names at all. I wasn't sure if it was, you know, exposed somewhere in the model properties, you know, if we crack open Tabular Editor or something like that.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Tom says this is also a great place where you can use the impact analysis feature in Power BI. This lets you easily announce an impending change to all downstream users. This is close to a magic bullet as anything I've seen in a product. And yes, thank you for articulating better what I was thinking and probably didn't spit out well. So thank you. I totally agree.
And that's actually, I want to give credit to Matthew for saying that to me. It looks like I said it.
Oh, yes, indeed. Thank you,
Thanks,
Matthew.
Matthew.
Yes, for those who don't know Matthew, he's a key person on the Power BI CAT team at Microsoft, and he's joined us this evening.
I want to point out that everything that I know about Power BI, I learned from Melissa. So I'm here for cheating in the evening to learn for what I'm going to talk about on the CAT team tomorrow. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming.
He jokes.
Matthew.
He jokes. But, you know, at the very beginning, by the way, I mentioned, so this is, let me just take a moment because we also have Peter Myers with us as well. So at the very beginning, you heard me mention the Power BI adoption roadmap. Let me pop the URL in here while I have it. And the new, not yet complete, but baby steps. We are publishing some Power BI implementation planning guidance. So I'm working closely with Matthew and Peter, who are both on this call on this, and they're both amazing to work with. So that's all super fun. So. And in terms of usage scenarios, we're going to have 2 more of them land in the next week or so. We'll see how fast they get through the publishing process. But two new ones are coming, and then after that, in coming weeks and months, a bunch more stuff. So stay tuned.
Great. And I see Elena is asking any advice for what you would or would not package into an app.
Well, let's think about that for a second. So an app is a collection of reports and dashboards. We would want, so if I make this, I sort by include in app. I've got a couple of examples purposefully created here in my demo environment for things that, for instance, if I just use this example because it comes to mind, the scope of this workspace is sales analytics. It should be just traditional sales reporting versus targets, etc. Someone has chosen to put highly restricted customer data in this workspace. It shouldn't be here. It's got a higher sensitivity label, so we're protecting it with some other data protection policies and that sort of thing. And at least one mitigating factor is we're not including it in the app. But that's just my contrived example to say, you know, when we're talking about workspace planning and what should and shouldn't be there of, hey, this is a bad example. So what should and shouldn't be in the app? I lean towards these are just the reports that are ready to be presented to users. And, you know, in a state, if I go to a different window and we look at the app, and in a state where, you know, we've got our nice menu and our nice experience and so forth. So is there another aspect of your question? Because
I have a complex report with way too many tabs pulling in data from several different sources. And I've never really implemented an app on my primary user dashboard and collection of reports. And so I was thinking I would take this mass report, which is used by all of our team rather than just like the management staff, package it into an app and break it into 2 or 3 different reports to be sent as a part of that app so that they don't have the big kahunga that is thus therefore much too slow.
yeah, so that could work nicely, especially because each one of these reports, you know, ends up being a menu item over here, right? And you could, they don't have to be in these separate little drop downs, right? That's kind of up to you. And that's one of the nice things about the app is that it is a little bit nicer, more elegant experience for users with this menu. And we can do things like linking to KPIs in a glossary or a starter report template. So, hey, I neglected something somewhere along the line when I was demoing. So let me backtrack a second and then I'm going to finish answering your question, Elena. So one very important piece of the puzzle is report branding. So down here, I've got a little logo and a little message that just says this is tier 1 content and it's been verified. So whatever you call it, this means it's been through the paces, it's trustworthy. Now you might just say certified. You might say tier 1 content, it might be managed, it might be governed, whatever, however you want to classify it. But this kind of report branding gets recognized by people. And then if they're looking at a report and they don't see it, they wonder why not. So the reason I backtracked to that is if you're going to allow people to use this report as a starting point for their own reports, doing this kind of branding is a
Bad plan.
Is a bad plan, right? Suddenly now it's useless. So what I'm doing here in the app is linking to a report template. This is just another PBIT file with the starter reports, and this is gone. Now, this also presumes, by the way, that the same group of people that are viewing your app are also the same group of people that would be building new content from it. And that can be a big assumption that is not always true. But from a demo perspective, it's a really good way to illustrate a different way to deliver a starter report without letting people dilute your report branding. So I like your idea.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
If I do package it into an app, can I put a bookmark within one of the 2 or 3 now tab reports linking to another report also in the app? And the reason I'm asking that is because I'd like to build how to use this page documentation that isn't in the main report with all of its tabs, but can be very quickly popped to from some little bookmark box at the top.
Yep, as far as I am aware, that's all doable. And if anybody knows any different, please holler. But I don't know of any limitations that would cause that any concern at all.
Then that's worth the time it will take to put it all together, packaging nicely. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Good. All right, let's see here. If I separate dataset and visualization files, will I get to set RLS on the visualization part? Yes, but let me just be a little bit picky about how that was phrased. And we always set RLS actually on the data set. So even though we see it take effect down in the reports, it's actually not set on the visualization, it's set on the data set. So just to kind of be super clear about how we phrase that. But yes, if you separate them there is only reader, build, or viewer on that data set, RLS will take effect in the reports. Yes.